There are names that history remembers with clarity: Himmler, Heydrich, Eichmann. They are names that have been engraved in the collective conscience as synonyms for absolute horror. And then there is Ernst Kaltenbrunner. He measured nearly 2 meters tall. His face was crossed by deep scars. He would arrive at meetings with the breath of alcohol and with the weight of millions of deaths upon his signature. In the Nuremberg trials, the writer Evelyn Waugh observed him from the public gallery and wrote in his diary that among all the defendants only Kaltenbrunner had the appearance of an obvious criminal. Fact 1. He was born in the very heart of Austrian pan-Germanism, in a family where anti-Semitism was a table talk understanding. On the 4th of October 1903, in Ried im Innkreis, a provincial city in northern Austria on the banks of the River Inn, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was born. The date is a detail that historical chance has rendered ironic. Ried im Innkreis is the same district that would give the world, barely 14 years earlier, Adolf Hitler in nearby Braunau am Inn. The name of the place should not deceive with its peaceful sonority. Ried im Innkreis was, in the early years of the 20th century, one of those middle-class Austrian communities where pan-German nationalism was not a radical political stance, but almost the air one breathed. The Habsburg Empire, multinational and multi-ethnic, was slowly disintegrating under the weight of its own contradictions. And in that fragmentation, the Germans of Austria saw an existential threat, the dissolution of their identity in a mare magnum of Czechs, Slovaks, Slovenes, Poles and Hungarians who claimed the same rights, the same jobs, the same schools. The father of Ernst, Hugo Kaltenbrunner, was a lawyer, a cultured man of good social standing who would eventually practice in one of the most prestigious law firms in Linz. Hugo had passed through the university fraternities, the Burschenschaften, those student brotherhoods that fused saber dueling, distilled alcohol and pan-German ideology into a single tribal identity. Like many of his generation and class, he never abandoned that mentality. Although over time he softened his methods and moderated his language, he never abandoned the belief that Austria should join the German Reich, and that the Jews, although he could have perfectly cordial business relations with individual Jews, collectively constituted a foreign body in the national organism. This anti-Semitism of Hugo Kaltenbrunner was not violent or visceral in its domestic expression. It was something perhaps more dangerous, the abstract, intellectualized version, which converts a human group into a concept before converting it into a target. According to the memory of Werner Kaltenbrunner, the younger brother of Ernst, who years later would give testimony to historians, the father rejected all social contact with Jews despite his business relations. And that rejection, transmitted without the softening of real human contacts, was inherited by Ernst in the form of pure abstraction. Jewry as a faceless enemy, as a threat without a proper name. Ernst was the firstborn. He grew up in that environment, breathing those ideas as if they were natural laws, just as one breathes oxygen without asking where it comes from. The family lived the early years in Raab, the current Aschach an der Steyr, a small town south of Linz where Hugo Kaltenbrunner practiced his first legal work. The town had perhaps a few hundred inhabitants. It had a church, a local brewery, an amateur theatre. It had the Hannelholz forest where the Kaltenbrunner children hunted snakes, gathered wild strawberries and mushrooms, and built their first private cosmologies among the trees. Ernst would remember Raab, decades later from his cell in Nuremberg, as the paradise of his childhood, an idyllic place of rural harmony where the village doctor and the humblest peasant lived together in perfect natural hierarchy, a place without class conflicts, without disruptive modernity, without foreign influences. In his letter to his children, he wrote with a genuinely disturbing tenderness about the poor parents who deliberated in low voices whether they could afford a mug of beer for dinner, about the mothers who did not miss more than one day of fieldwork after giving birth, about the old men who prepared with their own hands the boards of their coffins while sharpening the scythe and asking the neighbour if he also had dry wood. What Kaltenbrunner called the happiest years of my life was, in reality, the perfect breeding ground to manufacture one of the greatest criminals of the 20th century. Not because Raab was an especially bad place, but because the mind of the child Ernst transformed that rural past into a myth. And upon that myth, the organic community, pure, rooted in the land, without artificial divisions, without foreigners, he would build his complete ideological system. Everything that would come later, the university duels, the fraternities, the SS, the Gestapo, the deportation orders, was, in his head, a defense of that imaginary Raab against the forces that wanted to destroy it. It was the first, and perhaps the most decisive step in the formation of a state criminal. Fact 2. His father expelled him from the church altar as a child, and that early rejection of Catholicism marked his future career as a persecutor of the clergy. At 7 or 8 years of age, little Ernst began to serve as an altar boy in the elementary school of Raab. He liked the solemnity of the ritual, the smell of incense, the sensation of belonging to something larger than himself. In the memories he would write from Nuremberg, there is a note of authenticity in this episode that suggests the experience was genuinely important for the child. It was an ordered, hierarchical world with clear rules and a community that recognized him and gave him a role. But when Hugo Kaltenbrunner learned that his son was serving Mass, he reacted with a fury that must have been terrifying for a child of that age. The Kaltenbrunners were anti-clerical in the deepest sense of the term. For them, the Catholic Church was the ideological arm of the empire that prevented unification with Germany, the ally of the Habsburgs, the domestic enemy of pan-Germanism. The priests who sent their parishioners to pray for the emperor and preached against the union with the Protestant Reich of the North were, in the logic of Hugo Kaltenbrunner, as much enemies of Germany as any Czech politician or any Jewish banker. Ernst was removed from his duties. At first he continued in secret, unable to understand the paternal Führer. But with time, as he would write decades later, he internalized the message. The priests, he wrote, could not communicate to me more than what I could already decipher for myself, and the worldview that I have built over the years does not come from them. This early expulsion from Catholicism had consequences that would extend for decades. When Kaltenbrunner became chief of the RSHA in 1943, he inherited an organization with an entire infrastructure of surveillance over the clergy. The Gestapo monitored sermons, religious printed materials were censored, priests who spoke from the pulpit against the policies of the regime were arrested, sent to concentration camps, or directly executed. Kaltenbrunner did not have the visceral phobia of Heydrich toward Catholicism, but neither did he have any hesitation in applying prohibitions on preaching to defeatist priests in 1944 and 1945, or in supporting the suppression of the investigations of SS Judge Konrad Morgan when these drew near to the dungeons of the Gestapo. What he learned from his father in Raab was that the church was an obstacle to the ideal of the racial community, and that this obstacle had to be overcome. The exact way in which it was overcome was a technical detail. Fact 3. He studied at the Real Gymnasium in Linz at the same institution that had forged the first political convictions of Adolf Hitler and joined a student brotherhood of pan-German and anti-clerical orientation. In September of 1913, at 10 years old, Ernst Kaltenbrunner left Raab forever. His father had decided that he should receive a technical education in Linz, drawn by the child's interest in the machinery of the local blacksmith shop and brewery. He settled in a boarding house managed by the widow of the lawyer Bertha Katzer, whom Ernst would remember in his Nuremberg letter as excessively strict and mean. The Real Gymnasium in Linz was the same type of secondary institution where 15 years earlier the young Adolf Hitler had formed his own pan-German convictions. Hitler would pay tribute in Mein Kampf to his history teacher, a man named Leopold Pötsch, for exposing with passion German history against the anti-German machinations of the Habsburgs. In that environment of the mid-agonizing empire, nationalist fervor was not the exception but the dominant emotional tone. Kaltenbrunner was not a brilliant student. His teacher from that period, Dr. Ernst Koreff, who decades later would recognize with gratitude that the already all-powerful Kaltenbrunner had saved him from being interned in Dachau, despite being half Jewish, would remember him as a lad without especially distinctive features, generally pleasant and well-educated, with a certain self-awareness in which his attractive appearance presumably played a role. A boarding house companion, by contrast, painted a different portrait. When the point was reached at which one believed to have convinced him, he became obstinate and impermeable to reason. In the Real Gymnasium, Kaltenbrunner joined the Penneburschenschaft Hohenstaufen, a student brotherhood modelled on the pan-German university fraternities. The Hohenstaufen, named after the medieval dynasty that had attempted to create a great unified German empire, had a clear anti-clerical and pan-German inclination, and its members directed their energy and their hostility especially against rival Catholic student organizations. It was the first organized community to which Ernst Kaltenbrunner belonged by his own choice, beyond his family. It gave him what he had lost upon leaving Raab, a circle of loyals, an identity, a common enemy against which to assert that identity. He was 13 years old, and he was already practicing politics as a form of war. Fact 4. His life at the University of Graz was a cycle of debts, duels, and organized racism that he himself directed from student leadership positions. In the autumn of 1921, Kaltenbrunner arrived at the Technical University of Graz at 18 years old and, at least in theory, with the ambition of becoming an engineer. What he found instead was the Arminia, one of the most virulent and politically active fraternities on the Austrian university scene. The Arminia was a Burschenschaft, a university brotherhood with dueling. Its principles were those of the pan-German movement of the previous generation, but carried to a new intensity by the trauma of the defeat in the First World War and the humiliation of the peace treaties. Its members identified with the aristocracy of the race, the university student as guardian of German culture, and expressed that identification through an elaborate ritual that included songs, secret passwords, nicknames taken from Nordic mythology, and the saber duel as an initiation rite. Kaltenbrunner was not a brilliant student. He switched from chemistry to law after 2 years, supposedly due to a lack of funds, although his brother Werner painted a more honest portrait. Ernst had discovered that chemistry demanded too much discipline to accommodate his extracurricular activities, while law in Austria was traditionally more flexible with the student's time. What he was, without a doubt, was a duelist of reputation. In the fraternity slang, he was a verlässliche Partie, a reliable partner for the duel because of his firm stance and his reckless courage with the saber. The Mensur, the university duel with a short-bladed saber and without facial protection, was considered in the environment of the Burschenschaften as a test of character and bravery. The scars it left the so-called Schmissewehr marks of social honor, visible signs that the bearer had proven his mettle. In the Graz years, Kaltenbrunner accumulated chronic debts. His monthly allowance of 200 Austrian shillings, approximately $40 of the time, a respectable sum, constantly disappeared. More than once he had to borrow money from his brother Werner, who had arrived to study law at the same university in the autumn of 1923. Kaltenbrunner Sr. was irritated by this irresponsibility, but Ernst's mother, Theresia, who had a weakness for her firstborn, frequently sent small additional sums to cover his debts. Social life included several girlfriends and at least one prolonged relationship with a divorcee that raised eyebrows among the fraternity brothers. He drank without limit. He participated in the wild fights into which political discussions in the boarding house rooms degenerated, but what distinguished him from other turbulent young university students was the ideological coldness that operated beneath the personal chaos. While accumulating debts and brawls, he also methodically ascended in the organizational structures of the pan-German student movement. He was secretary of the Vertreterbesprechung of Graz, the council that represented all dueling fraternities before the university. He represented Graz on the Statutes Committee of the National Deutsche Burschenschaft. He was for 2 years president of the committee of the Graz chapter of the Deutsche Burschenbund. In those positions, he organized campaigns of hate against Jewish, socialist, Catholic, and Slavic students. He coordinated them with the precision of someone who was already thinking in terms of institutional power, not individual passion. He was between 19 and 25 years old. He was already an organizer of persecutions. Fact 5. He organized the physical siege of university classrooms to block access to Jewish students, and the rector himself participated in the protest demonstration. The autumn of 1923 brought to the University of Graz an incident that galvanized the pan-German student movement. A university lecturer was supposedly insulted by a group of Jewish students who had resented his anti-Semitic attitude. The exact nature of the incident, whether it actually occurred, in what terms, with what prior provocations, remains blurred in the historical archives. And that ambiguity was, in a certain way, functional. The pretext barely mattered. What mattered was the response. Kaltenbrunner, in his capacity as president of the committee of the Graz chapter of the Deutsche Burschenbund, coordinated the action with a revealing efficiency. He organized gangs of student thugs, euphemistically described as surveillance patrols, to physically surround the classrooms and block the entrance to any student of Jewish appearance or identification. For several days, while the investigations to find the culprits followed their course, the Jewish students of the university were physically prevented from attending their classes. When the tactics of force did not produce the desired results, no one was identified as guilty because there was probably no real crime to investigate. The executive committee of the Burschenbund organized a massive demonstration on campus. The object of the protest was no longer to find culprits of a specific incident. It was the very presence of Jews in the university. Distinguished figures of the faculty participated. The rector of the university himself took part. The historians of the Arminia documented the episode with visible satisfaction, noting that the incident had demonstrated that professors and students were united in the struggle against Jewry. To understand what this means in historical terms, one must place it in its context. We are not in 1938, we are not in the Nazi Reich. We are in 1923 in a university of a democratic republic. The future chief of the RSHA was 20 years old and already organized university pogroms as other students organized philosophy debates. What these episodes reveal is not sadism or irrationality. They reveal a cold organizational capacity, the instinctive understanding that normalized collective violence is more effective than individual violence, and the willingness to use institutional positions for ends that the institutions in theory should not sanction. They are exactly the same skills that Kaltenbrunner would apply 20 years later from the office of Chief of the RSHA. Fact 6. He drafted and signed an official letter demanding that an Italian student organization be banned, using the South Tyrol as an argument at 19 years of age. On the 27th of January of 1923, a document signed in his own hand by Ernst Kaltenbrunner was deposited in the secretariat of the rectorate of the Karl Franzens University of Graz. It was an official letter in his capacity as secretary of the Vertreterbesprechung, the representative council of the dueling fraternities, demanding that official recognition be denied to an Italian student organization that had requested statutes before the university. The arguments of Kaltenbrunner were of a precision that is not that of a passionate adolescent, but that of a budding political operator. He cited the grave national situation of our oppressed compatriots in the territory ceded to Italy, the South Tyrol, incorporated into Italy after the First World War, despite its majority German-speaking population. He affirmed that it would be intolerable for enemies to acquire in German universities the intellectual instruments for the struggle against us. He declared that the Vertreterbesprechung had voted unanimously to resist the establishment of this club with all available means. This document, recovered from the University Archives of Graz and published by the historian Günther Czerwinka in the journal Blätter für Heimatkunde in 1976, is one of the first known writings of Kaltenbrunner and has an almost biographical value. It demonstrates that at 19 years of age, Kaltenbrunner was already operating with a logic of threats, institutional pressure, and collective mobilization against any presence he considered enemy. Note also what it says about his worldview. He did not differentiate between the Italian state as a sovereign power and the Italian students who simply wanted to study in Graz. In his mental scheme, they were all the enemy, and the university was a battlefield in the racial war, not a space of shared knowledge. This inability or this refusal to distinguish between the individual and the racial or national category to which they belonged would be the most revealing constant of all his subsequent career. Fact 7. The University of Graz, under the influence of the pan-German student movement, was a laboratory of organized violence that prefigured with exactitude the mechanisms of the Nazi terror. To understand Kaltenbrunner, one must understand the environment that formed him, because that environment was not a temporary aberration but the ecosystem that had been producing itself in Austrian universities since the late 19th century. The campus of Graz in the 1920s was the scene of a level of organized violence that would be unthinkable in any contemporary university institution. The pan-German fraternities had established the principle that the university was German Spacegermanischer Raumtau, which no student who was not of Aryan blood had a legitimate right. This principle was not merely rhetorical, it was applied through physical patrols, classroom access blocks, systematic intimidation, and assaults that university authorities rarely investigated with rigor. The Jewish students of Grazhou constituted a real but visible minority, especially in the faculties of medicine, and law lived with a hostility that could at any moment escalate into physical violence. The Czech, Slovene, or Italian students who arrived to study were received as invaders. The socialist or Catholic students who dared to defend their positions in public debates risked ending up in the hospital. Kaltenbrunner participated in all of this and organized it. But one must also record something else. In that environment, these activities were not perceived as crimes, but as service. The organizers of these campaigns saw themselves as defenders of German culture, as the guardians of a threatened civilization. This perception of virtue, the deep conviction of doing the right thing, of protecting what had values, the crucial psychological difference between the thug and the ideological fanatic. Kaltenbrunner was a fanatic, and fanatics, unlike thugs, do not stop when they reach their immediate objectives. Fact 8. He graduated in law in 1926 with remarkable speed given his circumstances, and spent 2 years seeking a community that would give him what the fraternity could no longer give him. In July of 1926, to the astonishment of his friends who knew his university habits, Ernst Kaltenbrunner completed his doctorate in law at the University of Graz. He had done it with striking speed. In barely 4 years of real studies, a rhythm that was only possible in the Austrian legal system of the time, where law was a discipline relatively manageable for students with basic intelligence and sufficient determination. He began then the first mandatory legal practice at the District Court of Linz, but before completing the year required by law, he moved to Salzburg to work in the office of the lawyer Willers. What he found there was unhappiness, a professional environment too formal for his tastes, the constant sensation of inadequacy, and, according to his own account in the Nuremberg letter, the rejection of a former girlfriend from his university days who lived in the city. I suffered from a constant sense of insufficiency, like a small duckling taken to the water for the first time, he wrote with an honesty that surprises in a man who would become the chief of the Gestapo. In 1928, he returned to Linz, where he found work in the office of the lawyer Franz Lasser, who attended to the peasants of the Mühlviertel, the mountainous region north of Linz. It was a job more suited to his roots, the contact with the rural world that he so nostalgized since Rabot, the young lawyer, continued feeling lost. I drifted, he wrote, toward an unsatisfactory tavern life. What he was seeking was not a job. He was seeking a community. The fraternity had given him for 5 years exactly that, a circle of loyals, a common enemy, a hierarchy in which to ascend, a collective identity that told him who he was and why he mattered. The Austrian professional world of the 20s, with its inevitable compromises with the system that he so much despised, could not give him any of that. And so he began to search. Fact 9. He joined the Nazi Party on the 18th of October of 1930, exactly 3 days after 3 leaders of the Heimwehr announced an alliance with the clericals in a decision that was not impulsive but political. The trajectory that led Kaltenbrunner to Nazism passed first through the Heimwehr, the right-wing paramilitary movement that had emerged from the post-war uprisings. In the summer of 1929, drawn by the rise to leadership of the charismatic Prince Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, an aristocrat who had marched with Hitler in the Putsch of 23, and who combined pan-German credentials with a personal charisma that Kaltenbrunner admired, he joined the Heimwehr of Upper Austria. He even left his job at the Lasser office to serve the movement full-time. It was the type of sacrifice that the political creed demanded and that Kaltenbrunner was perfectly willing to make. Material comfort had always been secondary for him, before ideological belonging. But the Heimwehr disappointed him systematically. Its leaders were not reliable. Some accepted money from Mussolini. Starhemberg met with the Duce in Venice and returned with promises of Italian arms and funds while publicly proclaiming his independence. In October of 1930, 3 leaders of the Heimwehrfey of Vienna, Raab of Lower Austria and Vass of Burgenland, announced an electoral alliance with the Christian Democrats, the clerical party that Kaltenbrunner had despised since childhood. The 15th of October of 1930 was the announcement of that alliance. The 18th of October of 1930, Ernst Kaltenbrunner enrolled in the Austrian National Socialist Party. It was not a coincidence of dates. It was a calculated and cold decision. The Nazis offered what the Heimwehr could not give: absolute ideological consistency, unmitigated rejection of the independent Austrian state, the irrevocable commitment to the Anschluss, and a leader, Hitler, who had never asked for apologies from anyone for anything. For Kaltenbrunner, whose political vision was a direct extension of the principles of the Arminia of Gradz: compromise, no concession, the racial community as the only absolute value Nazism was not a novelty. It was the logical conclusion of everything he had believed since childhood. Fact 10. His SS number was 13,039, and he obtained it after personally meeting Sepp Dietrich in Munich, choosing the most radical path at a moment in which that path had real consequences. 15 months after joining the Nazi Party, in the summer of 1931, while small units of the SS were being established in the Austrian provincial capitals under the chain of command of SS Standartenführer Joseph Sepp Dietrich, Kaltenbrunner attended a party event in Munich. There he met Dietrich himself, the commander of Hitler's personal guard, who urged him to apply for admission into the Black Order. Kaltenbrunner responded to the call. On the 31st of August of 1931, he was admitted into the SS with the number 13,039. This number is more than a figure. It is a historical statement. It means that Kaltenbrunner was not an opportunist who joined the SS when the wind blew in favor of Nazism. In 1931 in Austria, the party was illegal, and its members risked their careers, their freedom, and their physical safety in a very concrete way. To be SS in Austria in 1931 was to expose oneself to arrests, to the loss of clients if you were a lawyer, to the pressure of the authorities of the Dollfuss state that would come later. There were no material rewards, there was no guarantee of victory. There was only the ideological certainty and the community of those who shared that certainty. The historian Peter R. Black, in his fundamental study on Kaltenbrunner published by Princeton University Press in 1984, points out that those who entered the movement before the German elections of September of 1930, that is, without having seen the electoral wave that showed that Nazism could win, voluntarily submitted themselves to the social and emotional straitjacket of the totalitarian regime. Kaltenbrunner not only put on that straitjacket, he adopted it as a second skin, and unlike many who adopted it for opportunism and abandoned it when the price became too high, he never let it go. Not even on the gallows of Nuremberg. Fact 11. While serving as legal advisor to the SS, he provided free defense to members arrested for criminal activities, including fugitive murderers from the Reich. In October of 1932, the head of the SA and SS, Ernst Röhm, appointed legal advisors for each Gotha-territorial constituency with the objective of providing immediate and free legal aid to members of the SA and the SS arrested while performing their duties. Kaltenbrunner was appointed legal advisor of the SS for the SS Abschnitt 8. The case that best illustrates what this meant in practice involves a Prussian schoolteacher named Paul Majora. In September of 1932, Majora and 3 companions, all members of the SS from Königsberg, were arrested in Linz for entering Austria illegally. But there was something more. The Prussian authorities were claiming them for the murder of a social democratic newspaper editor in Königsberg on the night following the elections of the 31st of July. Kaltenbrunner, along with the SA legal advisor Georg Ettinghausen, intervened before the Austrian authorities, arguing that the crime, even if it had been committed by Majora and his companions, should be considered a political act and not extraditable. The 2 lawyers won the argument. The 4 men were released in December of 1932. A police report noted that Kaltenbrunner had lodged them in a boarding house in Linz and had organized their maintenance with Nazi party funds. On the 23rd of December of 1932, Majora and his companions crossed the border into Italy. In summary, the future chief of the Gestapo had used his legal skills to free 4 fugitive murderers and facilitate their escape from justice. It was 1932. Kaltenbrunner was 29 years old and already knew exactly how the system he would soon control functioned. Fact 12. He married the day before being arrested in January of 1934 as a juridical tactic. and in the detention camp he organized a hunger strike that bent the government. In the early days of January of 1934, Kaltenbrunner received information that he would be detained in an imminent raid by the government of Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss against the Nazis. His response was as calculated as it was revealing of his character. On the 14th of January, he contracted marriage with Elisabeth Eder, daughter of a prosperous merchant from Linz, whom he had known since at least 1930. The matrimonial calculation was clear. Being a newly married husband could complicate legal procedures, generate sympathy among judges, and, in the worst case, create a domestic figure more difficult to demonize before public opinion. The following day, the 15th of January of 1934, he was arrested and sent to the detention camp of Kaisersteinbruch in Upper Austria. The conditions in Kaisersteinbruch were not those of an extermination camp, but they were deliberately degrading for Austrian standards: deficient sanitary facilities, insufficient food rations, temperatures that in winter fell below zero in barracks without adequate thermal insulation, and frequent mistreatment by the Heimwehr guards who watched over the prisoners with a brutality that reflected the accumulated hate between the two movements. Kaltenbrunner did not tolerate it in silence. In April of 1934, he organized with several companions a formal hunger strike with precise demands: improvement of food, functional sanitary facilities, cessation of mistreatment, and ultimately release of all prisoners. The Secretary of State for Security, Ludwig Karwinski, tried to negotiate with the strikers. He failed. The strikers held firm. Finally, weakened by the fast but not defeated in their stance, Kaltenbrunner and several companions were evacuated to a hospital. The government yielded. It released 90% of the Nazi prisoners detained in Austria. It was a minor political victory, but symbolically significant. Kaltenbrunner had demonstrated that organized collective will could bend state authority, even from the position of maximum vulnerability. The lesson remained engraved, and he would apply it, in an infinitely more brutal manner, from the other side of power. Fact 13. He built an intelligence network in southeastern Europe that impressed Himmler and put him on the radar of Berlin while publicly acting as a moderate. Between 1934 and 1938, Kaltenbrunner lived in two simultaneous and parallel realities that touched but never completely merged in public. The first was the visible reality, that of the moderate political operator who served as secretary to Anton Reintaler, the man who proposed integrating Austrian Nazis into the Schuschnigg political system through peaceful negotiations. In this role, Kaltenbrunner met figures such as Hermann Neubacher, brilliant economist with contacts with Göring, Franz Langoth, former security director of Upper Austria, and Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Viennese lawyer of trust to Schuschnigg himself. These contacts were genuinely useful, and Kaltenbrunner cultivated them with skill. The second reality was clandestine. While acting as a moderate, Kaltenbrunner reconstructed in the shadow the SS Standard 37 in Upper Austria and expanded his intelligence network towards Southeast Europe. This network included contacts in Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania, and Bulgaria, the region that later would become his area of specialization within the RSHA. Through these contacts, Kaltenbrunner supplied Berlin with reports on the internal politics of the Balkan countries, on the movements of German communities abroad, on the intentions of local governments regarding Germany. Himmler received these reports and was impressed. In 1940, he already considered Kaltenbrunner as a possible German ambassador in Switzerland. In 1942, he proposed him as a possible Reich Commissioner for Belgium. On each occasion, circumstances prevented the appointment, but Himmler's interest was real, and its origin was in those years of clandestine work and double life in Schuschnigg's Austria. Fact 14. The Anschluss of the 12th of March of 1938 was his moment of catharsis. That night he participated in the arrests of Austrian government ministers and emerged as the most powerful man in his native country. On the 12th of March of 1938, when the troops of the Wehrmacht crossed the Austrian border in an operation without shots, Mussolini had withdrawn his guarantee of Austrian independence, and the Schuschnigg government collapsed without resistance. Kaltenbrunner did not wait for instructions from Berlin. He acted on his own terms. That night, with SS columns under his direct command, he participated in the arrest operations that dismantled the Schuschnigg government in a matter of hours. Ministers were taken from their offices or their homes, in some cases in pajamas, and taken to places of detention that a few days earlier would have been illegal. The clandestine apparatus that Kaltenbrunner had built during 7 years of underground work deployed itself with an efficiency that surprised even the observers from Berlin. 3 days later, on the 15th of March of 1938, Himmler swore in the Austrian Federal Police at the Heldenplatz in Vienna, the same square where that same day Hitler spoke before a crowd that contemporaries estimated at hundreds of thousands of people, with a roar of jubilation that shook the surrounding buildings. On the dais, alongside Himmler, was Kaltenbrunner. Reinhard Heydrich was also there, the chief of the Reich Security Police, by whose side Kaltenbrunner would appear in photographs that would be presented as evidence in Nuremberg. Kaltenbrunner was appointed Höherer SS und Polizeiführer Higher SS and police leader for the Donau, the new administrative name for Austria within the Reich. His rank was SS Gruppenführer und Generalleutnant der Polizei Major General of the SS and Police. He was 34 years old. He was the most powerful man in his native land. And the path that had started in the damp rooms of the Linz boarding house with the debates that degenerated into fights and the debts he asked of his brother had reached its first great reward. Fact 15. He supervised the establishment in Vienna of the first Central Office for Jewish Emigration, the model that would later be replicated across occupied Europe for mass deportation. Among his first responsibilities after the Anschluss was coordination with Adolf Eichmann, who, according to multiple sources, had been a fellow student of Kaltenbrunner at the Real Gymnasium in Linz, to establish and operate the Zentralstelle für jüdische Auswanderung, the Central Office for Jewish Emigration of Vienna. The architecture of terror that this office applied was of a brutality that worked precisely because of its bureaucratic rationality. The Viennese Jews, who constituted the largest German-speaking Jewish community outside the Reich, approximately 180,000 people in March of 1938, 10.8% of the city's population were subjected to a systematic process of dispossession that began with the presence of a Gestapo employee and ended with the signing of documents that formalized the confiscation of properties, businesses, bank accounts, and belongings, in exchange for an emigration permit that became increasingly difficult to use as destination countries closed their borders. Eichmann was the operational architect of this process. Kaltenbrunner was the police authority who backed it with real executive power, the threat of arrest, of the concentration camp, of violence. In less than 18 months, more than 100,000 Austrian Jews had left the country, leaving behind their heritage, their history, their home, under this combination of bureaucracy and terror. What Vienna demonstrated was that forced emigration could work at an industrial speed if incentive sphere were correctly coordinated with the administrative machinery. This model was presented to the Reich authorities as a success and proposed to be replicated in all occupied Europe, and it was replicated. The testing ground was Vienna. The laboratory was in the charge of Kaltenbrunner. Fact 16. While controlling the Viennese security apparatus, he also developed a political economic intelligence network in the Balkans that became his most valuable credential before Himmler. Between 1938 and 1943, while Kaltenbrunner managed the apparatus of terror in former Austria, controlling the Viennese Gestapo, supervising the labor camps, coordinating with Eichmann on Jewish affairs, he also developed in parallel what was perhaps his greatest individual asset, a political economic intelligence network that extended throughout the region of Southeast Europe. This network, which operated through the Southeast Europe Society, Südosteuropa Gesellschaft, and personal contacts cultivated over years, supplied Berlin with reports on Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Turkey that went beyond purely military matters. They included analysis of internal political trends, the positions of various power groups regarding Germany, the possibilities of influencing the decisions of local governments. Himmler, who always sought in the SD something more than military espionage, he wanted political intelligence that would allow him to operate as an autonomous actor in the Reich's foreign policy, was genuinely impressed by the quality of Kaltenbrunner's reports. In January of 1943, just days before the appointment was made public, he wrote to him asking that he re-establish the contacts that Heydrich held in his hands. It was a tacit recognition. Himmler was not simply filling a vacancy. He was betting on someone whose specific ability he needed. Fact 17. He was chosen as chief of the RSHA in part because Hitler distrusted Himmler and wanted a second Austrian of direct loyalty to the Führer at the vertex of the terror apparatus. The process of choosing Kaltenbrunner to succeed Heydrich was not simple nor unidirectional. Historians have documented at least 4 converging factors that led to the decision. First, Himmler's perception that Kaltenbrunner was an expert in political intelligence, especially in the Balkans, an area where the SD had severe deficiencies since the death of Heydrich. Second, Himmler's confidence in the absolute loyalty of Kaltenbrunner. The Reichsführer SS needed someone to direct the RSHA without attempting to turn it into his own personal power base, as some feared Heydrich would have done had he survived. Kaltenbrunner, who lacked the support network in Berlin or the political skill of Heydrich, seemed less threatening. Third, the backing of Martin Bormann, the head of the party chancellery. Bormann saw in Kaltenbrunner a possible ally in his own power intrigues and actively supported him. The appointment arrived in January of 1943, exactly 3 months before Bormann obtained the position of personal secretary to the Führer in April of that year, a promotion in which the support of the new chief of the RSHA was not irrelevant. Fourth, Hitler himself pressed for Kaltenbrunner. According to Walter Schellenberg, Himmler's masseur and confidant Felix Kirsten had reported that Hitler seemed convinced that this tough guy possessed all the necessary qualifications for the post, with unconditional obedience, personal loyalty, and the fact that he was an Austrian compatriot being significant characteristics. This fourth factor is the most disturbing. Hitler saw in Kaltenbrunner, among other things, a lever of control over Himmler. The dictator distrusted the Reichsführer SS, who had under his command the most powerful security apparatus in the Reich, and wanted someone at the apex of that apparatus whose primary loyalty was to the Führer, not to Himmler. Kaltenbrunner, in short, was convenient for 3 different people for 3 different reasons. That did not make him less dangerous. It made him more so. Fact 18. His own subordinates in the RSHA testified that he exercised full executive authority over the entire apparatus, including the gas chambers, radically contradicting his version at Nuremberg. On the witness stand at Nuremberg, Kaltenbrunner presented a version of his years as chief of the RSHA that can be summarized in 4 denials: that he had no real responsibility over the security police, that the Gestapo and the Kripo reported directly to Himmler without going through him, that Heydrich's special missions, including the final solution, had not been transferred to him, and that he did not know about the gas chambers until March of 1944. 4 of his subordinates, from different departments and with different motivations to testify, dismantled this version point by point. Walter Schellenberg, chief of SD Ausland and the most intelligent and antipathetic subordinate toward Kaltenbrunner in the entire RSHA, declared that the Austrian made it explicitly clear in his official relations with all of us that he was the chief of the office, that he exercised full executive authority and determined all questions of policy. He allowed us to issue instructions within the organization in our own name, according to the guidelines he established, but all important matters had to be submitted to him. Otto Ohlendorf, chief of SD Inland, who was in many senses closer ideologically to Kaltenbrunner than Schellenberg, and therefore less interested in sinking him, declared that Kaltenbrunner was determined to be the boss in the RSHA. Even when department heads received direct orders from Himmler, Kaltenbrunner had to be informed. Hermann Pister, the commander of Buchenwald between 1943 and 1945, declared that all prisoners of that camp had been sent there by the RSHA and that the preventive arrest orders uniformly bore the signature of Kaltenbrunner. And Rudolf Höss, the commander of Auschwitz, declared that although in matters of internal administration he reported to Glücks and Pohl, the WVH, a chain of command, the individual and collective internment and execution orders arrived from the RSHA, almost all signed by Müller as subordinate to Kaltenbrunner. When the prosecutor presented before Kaltenbrunner documents with his signature linked to specific crimes, the accused systematically responded that others had signed in his name. There were hundreds of such documents. To give credit to his story, one would have to imagine Kaltenbrunner as an incompetent who allowed his name to be systematically used without his knowledge. His own subordinates had already discarded that possibility. Fact 19. He knew of the genocide since his first weeks in the post because his own archives fed the most honest statistical report the regime produced on the extermination while it was occurring. On the 18th of January of 1943, 12 days before the appointment of Kaltenbrunner as chief of the RSHA was officially formalized, Himmler ordered the Reich's statistics inspector, Richard Korher, to compile a complete statistical report on the progress of the final solution of the European Jewish question. Simultaneously, Himmler instructed the future chief of the RSHA to interrupt the statistical reports that were being prepared in the RSHA offices, and to cooperate fully with Korher, providing him with unrestricted access to the relevant archives. The Korher report, classified as top secret, with absolutely restricted distribution to the highest levels of the Reich, was presented to Himmler on the 27th of March of 1943. It was 16 pages long. It estimated that 4.5 million European Jews had emigrated or died up to that date, using euphemisms that no one in the highest levels of the regime needed to decipher. It was the most honest statistical document that the Nazi Reich produced on the genocide while it was occurring. The data that built that report came from the RSHA archives, the archives that Kaltenbrunner supervised from the first day of his mandate. When 4 months later, on the 22nd of May of 1943, Himmler telephoned Kaltenbrunner to speak of Jewish affairs and evacuation of Jews. The telephone register of the Reichsführer SS that survived the war and was presented as evidence shows the two men discussing the logistical details with the same naturalness with which two executives would talk about supply chains. Kaltenbrunner told the court at Nuremberg that he did not know about the gas chambers until March of 1944. The archives demonstrate that he knew about it with statistical precision since before formally assuming the post. He lied to the court with a fluency that can only be explained by the depth of his conviction that he could get away with it, or by the magnitude of his inability to assume responsibility for something he genuinely believed to have done right. Fact 20. He signed decrees that deprived Jews of basic legal rights, including the right to challenge judicial decisions, to take an oath, and to inherit, and he pressed the government when it wanted to archive them as unnecessary. In the autumn of 1942, even before Kaltenbrunner assumed the RSHA, the Reich was debating internally whether it was necessary to promulgate a new decree that would deprive Jews of the last vestiges of legal rights, the right to appeal administrative or judicial decisions, the capacity to take an oath before courts, and the right for their assets to be inherited by their families instead of automatically confiscated by the state upon their death. A draft of the decree was prepared on the 25th of September of 1942. But in early 1943, while the gas chambers functioned at full capacity, the Ministry of the Interior considered that the decree was, in its own words, superfluous in view of the development of the Jewish question. Kaltenbrunner challenged it. He sent a letter to the Minister of the Interior, Wilhelm Frick, on the 8th of March of 1943, arguing that the decree was necessary for 3 reasons. It covered Jews who had not yet been deported because they were married to Germans. It legalized and simplified the confiscation of Jewish property by the Reich. And it would anchor in positive law the principle that the pursuit of criminal proceedings against Jews passes from the Ministry of Justice to the police. Kaltenbrunner won the argument. The decree was promulgated on the 21st of April of 1943. What makes this episode especially revealing is its small relative scale. We are not talking about the deportation orders that sent hundreds of thousands of people to Auschwitz. We are talking about a legal technicality that affected a few tens of thousands of Jews who had survived in the Reich for reasons of mixed marriage or personal renown. Kaltenbrunner did not only execute Nazi policy, he bureaucratically perfected it, closing every crack through which any person might escape through the interstices of the legal system. Fact 21. He traveled personally to Budapest in March of 1944 to negotiate the deportation of more than 700,000 Jews and returned to Berlin, leaving Eichmann with precise instructions. On the 18th of March of 1944, German troops occupied Hungary. Horthy, the regent, was detained in the castle of Klesheim while the occupation was consummated. Kaltenbrunner traveled on the same train that returned Horthy to Budapest. On the 22nd of March, he met with the new pro-German Prime Minister Stoji in a session that contemporary sources describe as brief and efficient. Kaltenbrunner needed commitments. Stoji provided them. The Prime Minister promised not to hinder the deportations. At the express request of Kaltenbrunner, he introduced into the Ministry of the Interior two declared anti-Semites, Laszlo Baki and Laszlo Endred. First was a high official of the Hungarian gendarmerie with collaboration credentials well known in the SD archives as secretaries of state in charge of the Jewish question. Kaltenbrunner remained in Budapest several days coordinating the structure of the German police administration in occupied Hungary. Ribbentrop, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who had not been informed of the mission, guessed it and ordered his representative in Budapest, SS Standartenführer Edmund Wesenmeyer, to spy on the chief of the RSHA and discover the purpose of his presence. The deportations began on the 15th of May of 1944. They were carried out with a mechanical efficiency that the organizers themselves called exemplary. The trains left according to the planned schedule, the Hungarian authorities cooperated, the concentration camps within Hungary processed the Jews in the established order before sending them to the railway stations. By the 30th of June of 1944, 6 weeks after the start of the deportations, 381,600 Hungarian Jews had been sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Historians have estimated that approximately 240,000 of them were gassed upon arrival in the most intense period of operations of the Auschwitz gas chamber. Kaltenbrunner negotiated this, Kaltenbrunner organized it, and Kaltenbrunner on the witness stand at Nuremberg said he did not know it. Fact 22. On the 30th of June of 1944, he diverted 4 trains loaded with 12,000 Hungarian Jews toward a camp near Vienna, explaining in a letter that 70% were incapable of working and would remain available for a special action. On the 30th of June of 1944, Kaltenbrunner signed a letter addressed to SS Brigade Führer Hans Blaschke, the Nazi mayor of Vienna. Blaschke had requested that he be supplied with a transport of Hungarian Jews to work in the Viennese factories and in the fortification works surrounding the city in anticipation of the arrival of the front. Kaltenbrunner informed him that he had diverted 4 trains destined for Auschwitz toward the detention camp of Strasshof near Vienna. The 12,000 Jews involved would be placed at the disposal of Blaschke's labor needs. But the letter continued with a clause that the Nuremberg prosecutors would highlight in the process. Kaltenbrunner explained that only 30% of the deportees, that is, approximately 3,600 people, were capable of working. The remaining 70%, some 8,400 people, including children, the elderly and the sick, would be kept ready for a special action for which they would one day be removed. Special action. Sonderaktion in German was the euphemism established in the internal language of the regime to refer to execution or gassing. There is no possible ambiguity in this letter. Kaltenbrunner informed a functionary of his own regime that he had diverted a transport of people toward a destination where 70% would die. He did so with the same prosaic bureaucratic efficiency with which he might have sent a memo about office supplies. Fact 23. In October of 1944, he ordered the foot marches of tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews from Budapest toward Austria under conditions that killed several thousand during the journey, and protested when the International Red Cross tried to distribute safe conducts. On the 15th of October of 1944, the SS organized the coup d'état that overthrew Horthy and delivered power in Hungary to the fascist Arrow Cross movement of Ferenc Selassie. Horthy had decreed in July and August a halt to the deportations, moved by international pressure and by the awareness that the war was irredeemably lost for the Axis. The Arrow Cross regime was more docile, but even Selassie, conscious that the Allies were watching, was reluctant to a new round of mass deportations. On the 17th of October of 1944, 48 hours after the coup, Kaltenbrunner sent Eichmann back to Budapest with detailed instructions. Deport immediately 50,000 Jews and concentrate the rest in peripheral zones of the city for a subsequent action. Allied bombings had destroyed a large part of the Hungarian railway network. Auschwitz was being evacuated before the advance of the Red Army. There were no trains available in sufficient quantity to move tens of thousands of people. The alternative was the march on foot. From Budapest, groups of between several hundred and several thousand Jewsmen, women, small children, the elderly, the sick were led on foot in columns under custody of the Hungarian gendarmerie and members of the Arrow Cross toward the Austrian border, more than 190 kilometers away. Temperatures in October and November of 1944 in the interior of Hungary fell at night well below zero. The roads were of hardened mud or recent snow. The marchers did not have adequate winter clothing. Feeding was minimal or non-existent during journeys of up to 30 kilometers daily. Several thousand died on the way from hypothermia, exhaustion, hunger, or shot when they collapsed and could no longer get up. When envoys of the Red Cross and of the Swiss legation began to distribute safe conducts to the marchers, documents that the Hungarian police respected as proof of being under foreign protection, hundreds of Jews simply separated from the columns. Kaltenbrunner sent an angry note of protest to the German Foreign Ministry, complaining of the interference of neutrals. Pope Pius XII protested. The Swedish legation protested. Zalassi, before the combined pressure, ordered the marches stopped on the 21st of November of 1944. By then, between 27,000 and 40,000 people had been marched toward Austria. A significant fraction had died on the way. Fact 24. He was the only one of those condemned to death at Nuremberg who did not present an appeal for clemency, and his last words were a final denial of responsibility. The trial of Kaltenbrunner before the International Military Tribunal was, in many aspects, the last performance of a man who never accepted the reality of the world in which he lived if that reality contradicted his system of beliefs. He had suffered 2 cerebral hemorrhages during the waiting period, which delayed his appearance by weeks. When he finally sat in the dock, he presented the appearance of a man physically diminished compared to the giant of nearly 2 meters who had intimidated subordinates and partners for years. His face was heavy and pale, his scars more marked, his eyes restless. He cried in several sessions. Not a cry of remorse, which would have been hardly believable but humanly understandable, but a cry of self-pity and of incredulity at the situation in which he found himself. It was not the cry of a man who recognized having done evil. It was the cry of someone who genuinely did not understand why the world was judging him. He denied everything. He denied with an insistence that defied logic and documentary evidence. When prosecutors presented documents with his signature, deportation orders, circulars on the execution of prisoners of war, decrees on the treatment of foreign workers, he invariably affirmed that others had signed in his name, that it was Müller who really handled the Gestapo, that it was Himmler who took the decisions about the camps, that he was only the director of intelligence. His own men dismantled him, but perhaps the most revealing thing about his character arrived when the Allied Control Council, the instance of maximum appeal for those condemned, met on the 9th and 10th of October of 1946 to review the clemency petitions. All the other condemned to death presented appeals, some with legal arguments, others with declarations of health, others simply asking for mercy. Ernst Kaltenbrunner did not present any appeal. It was not stoicism, although it might seem so. It was the last expression of a system of values in which asking for clemency from an enemy was a form of surrender that no ideological soldier, his own description of himself in the Nuremberg interrogations, could allow himself. In the early hours of the 16th of October of 1946, at 1:36 in the morning, Kaltenbrunner entered the gymnasium of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice. He wore a dark blue sweater under a double-breasted coat. The correspondent Kingsbury Smith of the International News Service, one of the journalists chosen by lottery to witness the executions, described his entry with a precision that has become part of the historical record. With his lean and cadaverous face furrowed by old dueling scars, this terrible successor of Reinhard Heydrich cast a terrifying glance around him upon entering the room. He moistened his lips, apparently nervous as he turned to climb the gallows, but he walked with a firm step. When he was invited to make a last statement, he said in a low and clear voice, "I have loved my German people and my fatherland with a warm heart. I have fulfilled my duty according to the laws of my people, and I regret that in this most difficult hour my people was led by men who were not soldiers, and that crimes were committed of which I had no knowledge. Germany, good luck." It was the last lie of a life built upon a fundamental lie, the idea that he had served something noble. At 1:52 in the morning, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was pronounced dead. His remains, along with those of the others executed that morning, were transported to Munich and cremated in the Ostfriedhof crematorium. The ashes were poured into a tributary of the river Isar. There is no grave, there is no headstone, there is no place of pilgrimage for those who might still want to do so. It is the last small justice that history could offer him. Fact 25. The man who declared not knowing the crimes had visited Mauthausen at least 3 times, had witnessed executions in its gas chamber, and the photographs that proved it were presented at Nuremberg by a Spanish survivor. The concentration camp of Mauthausen was situated 25 kilometers east of Linz, the city where Kaltenbrunner had spent his childhood and adolescence. It was the only concentration camp classified in Category 3 of the Nazi system, the category of impossible return, reserved for prisoners considered irrecoverable for any form of productive life within the Reich. Its methods of execution included shooting in the back of the neck at the so-called blood wall, hanging on the beams of the armaments workshop, injection of phenol directly into the heart, gassing in the gas chamber built in 1941 with capacity for approximately 120 people simultaneously, and the so-called stairs of death method. Prisoners were forced to climb the 186 steps of the granite quarry carrying blocks of stone weighing between 30 and 50 kilograms. Those who collapsed were pushed down the stairs by the guards or simply abandoned until dying of exhaustion. Kaltenbrunner visited Mauthausen at least 3 times between the summer of 1942 and the summer of 1943, according to the testimonies presented before the Nuremberg tribunal. A former SS guard declared that the Austrian witnessed an execution in the gas chamber during his visit in the autumn of 1942. 3 prisoners placed Kaltenbrunner in the camp during the summer of 1943 in a visit during which, according to one of the witnesses, the RSHA had organized 3 different types of execution, hanging, gassing, and shooting as a demonstration for the benefit of the visitors. In the Nuremberg trial, the photographs that proved the presence of Kaltenbrunner in Mauthausen were presented by a survivor whose name has become an indissoluble part of the history of that process, Francisco Boy, a Catalan photographer who had fought in the International Brigades during the Spanish Civil War and who had fallen prisoner to the Germans in France in 1940. Bois, who managed to survive Mauthausen by working in the camp's photographic laboratory, had hidden for years, with the complicity of fellow prisoners and of women from the town of Mauthausen who risked their lives, thousands of photographs from the camp's archive. Among those photographs were those that showed Kaltenbrunner alongside Heinrich Himmler, the camp commander Franz Sierreis, and the Gauleiter of Upper Austria, August Eigruber, visiting the camp's facilities. Kaltenbrunner on the stand declared that he had never visited Mauthausen. The photographs said otherwise. It was the 7th of February of 1946. In the witness stand, Francisco Boix, the only Spaniard who testified in the Nuremberg trials, carefully identified each figure in the images he had risked his life to preserve. The courtroom listened in silence. The simultaneous translator transmitted his words in 4 languages. Kaltenbrunner looked away. There is a question that historians have debated for decades about Ernst Kaltenbrunner, and which in a certain way is the question that underlies all serious study of Nazism. How is such a man manufactured? Was he a congenital monster, an aberration of human nature, or was he the logical and predictable product of historical, social, and psychological forces that operated upon an ordinary individual? The historian Peter R. Black, who spent years in archives of 4 countries studying the life of Kaltenbrunner and published his research with Princeton University Press in 1984, rejects both extremes. Kaltenbrunner was not demonic in the supernatural sense. There was not in him any monstrous exceptionality that put him beyond human comprehension. Neither was he banal in the sense of Hannah Arendt, someone who simply obeyed orders without thinking. He was a man with real political capacity, with genuine organizational skills, with a recognizable inner life that included nostalgia, affection for his children, personal loyalties, and a coherent, although terribly misguided, worldview. What made him extraordinarily dangerous was not the absence of humanity, but the direction in which he oriented his humanity. He was a believer, not a hitman. A man who genuinely thought that what he did was necessary, just, and in the last instance, beneficial for the German people he claimed to love. This conviction, this faith is what makes his case more disturbing than that of the functionary who obeys orders out of cowardice or out of convenience. Because faith does not dissolve when external circumstances change. It does not yield before evidence. It does not bend before arguments. It adapts, it reframes, it reinterprets, but it persists. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was raised in a family where anti-Semitism was an axiom, in an empire where pan-Germanism was the dominant emotional code of his social class, in university fraternities where racist violence was a rite of passage. Each decision he took afterward, joining the Heimwehr, joining the SS, ascending in the apparatus of terror, signing deportation orders, visiting gas chambers, was the coherent consequence of the first decision, which was that of never questioning the ideological premises with which he was raised. There is no fatalism in this story. At each point of the path, real choices existed. The brother Werner was not a Nazi. The father Hugo himself, who had drunk the same ideology from the same source, never approved of Nazi violence as a method. Thousands of Austrians of the same class and background as Ernst Kaltenbrunner took different paths. But Ernst Kaltenbrunner chose this path, and he chose it not once, but repeatedly, at each crossroads where he could have turned. When he walked toward the gallows at 1:36 in the morning on the 16th of October of 1946, with the scars on his face and the name of Germany on his lips, he was exactly what he had always chosen to be, an ideological soldier of the Third Reich who did not repent of his service but of his defeat. That, perhaps, is the most terrifying thing of all this story. Not that such a man existed, but that it was possible to manufacture him with such ordinary ingredients.